What happens when Steve Harvey, a man who used to sleep in his car, becomes one of the successful entertainers in America, and then finds himself face to face with a host who wants to tear him down with sharp words and clever insults? It sounds like the start of a confrontation. What unfolded next was really powerful, because Steve Harvey was not another guest. He was someone who had been through a lot of struggles, fought a lot of battles, and climbed far to be shaken by a few harsh words. What followed was one of the unforgettable moments ever seen on daytime television. It was the moment when Steve Harvey calmly turned the situation around completely that his critic had nowhere left to go. The studio suddenly went quiet. The audience held their breath. Then something happened that had never happened before in the history of The View. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments, because this is one story you will definitely want to talk about afterward. The morning at the View studio had started like any other. The set was buzzing with its energy as the crew prepared for another live broadcast. Steve Harvey had been invited to promote his project, and everyone expected the interview to be entertaining and full of laughs. All Steve Harvey had built a reputation for lighting up every room he entered. His journey from struggling stand-up comedian to a media powerhouse was nothing of remarkable. Over the years, Steve Harvey had built an empire that included hit television shows, best-selling books, and a radio program that reached millions of listeners across the country every day. When Steve Harvey arrived at the studio, he looked the way fans expected him to look. He walked in wearing one of his signature suits, perfectly tailored and sharp. His famous mustache was neatly. His smile was already spreading positive energy among the production staff before the cameras even started rolling. At 67 years old, Steve Harvey had reached a level of success that most people only dream about. Despite all the fame, Steve Harvey still carried the same relatable personality that made audiences feel connected to him. Backstage in the room, Steve Harvey's team briefly went over possible talking points for the interview. Steve Harvey simply laughed and waved the notes away. After 3 decades of doing interviews, Steve Harvey did not feel the need to rehearse answers. What mattered most to Steve Harvey was being genuine. Being himself was the reason people connected with him in the place, and Steve Harvey trusted that authenticity more than anything else. What Steve Harvey did not realize was that someone else in the studio had come prepared with a completely different mindset. Joy Behar had arrived that morning with an intention. According to people behind the scenes, Joy Behar had been expressing skepticism about Steve Harvey for weeks. She often dismissed Steve Harvey's self-help advice as simple and criticized Steve Harvey's relationship books as patronizing. To Joy Behar, Steve Harvey's down-to-earth style seemed carefully crafted, almost like a performance designed to appeal to audiences Joy Behar believed were too easily impressed. That day, Joy Behar had decided she would challenge Steve Harvey directly and reveal what she believed was the truth behind Steve Harvey's image. Soon the bright studio lights switched on as Steve Harvey walked onto the set and took his seat at the table. Steve Harvey greeted each host warmly, his voice filling the room with friendly energy. The audience welcomed Steve Harvey enthusiastically. Many of them were viewers of Family Feud and had come specifically hoping to see Steve Harvey in person. Whoopi Goldberg began the segment with an introduction. "Our next guest is a man who seems to do everything," she said with a smile. "Television host, comedian, author, radio personality, and according to what I've heard, Steve Harvey owns suits than any man should legally be allowed to have." The audience burst into laughter. "Please welcome Steve Harvey." The applause continued as Steve Harvey stood up briefly, turning around with his arms spread wide to show off his tailored navy blue suit. "What can I say?" Steve Harvey joked. "A man's gotta look good. That's rule number 1 for success." The crowd laughed again. This was the Steve Harvey they had expected to see. Confident, charming, and naturally entertaining. The conversation started smoothly. Sarah Haynes asked about Steve Harvey's project, and Steve Harvey responded with an engaging explanation that quickly captured the audience's attention. Then Steve Harvey leaned back comfortably in his chair, shared a thought that resonated throughout the room. "You know what I've learned after all these years?" Steve Harvey said. "Success isn't about being the person in the room. It's about being the one who works the hardest. It's about getting up every single time life knocks you down." Steve Harvey paused for a moment before adding with a knowing smile, "Believe me, life knocked Steve Harvey down plenty of times before Steve Harvey figured that out." The audience nodded in agreement, clearly connecting with Steve Harvey's message. For minutes, everything felt relaxed and natural. Then Joy Behar leaned forward. The energy in the room shifted instantly. A sharp expression crossed Joy Behar's face, and the other hosts noticed it away. "So, Steve Harvey," Joy Behar began, her voice carrying a sharper tone than before. "Steve Harvey talks a lot about success and hard work." Joy Behar paused briefly before continuing. "Let's be honest here. A lot of Steve Harvey's success has come from telling people, Women, how they should live their lives. The room grew quieter. Joy Behar continued. Steve Harvey's book, Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man. Wasn't it basically a guide explaining how women should behave if they want to attract a man? Just like that, the friendly interview had taken a completely different turn. What had started as a conversation was suddenly becoming a confrontation. No one in that studio realized that Steve Harvey's next response would completely shift the entire atmosphere and leave everyone watching stunned. "Don't you think that's a little condescending?" Joy said, her voice sharp. "A man telling women what they are doing wrong?" The question was meant to corner him. Some people in the audience moved in their seats, feeling the tension. Steve Harvey did not look uncomfortable. His smile even seemed to get a bit wider. "Well, Joy," Steve said calmly, "that book sold over 3 million copies, so it seems like some women found it helpful." Some people in the audience laughed. "But I get your concern," he added smoothly. "It must be frustrating to see someone give advice that actually works, especially when advice has been given on this show for years and the divorce rate still hasn't changed." The reaction was immediate. Everyone in the studio gasped, laughed. The remark worked well. For a moment, Joy looked surprised. She recovered quickly. "That's cute, Steve," she said with a smile. "Let's talk about your personal record with relationships." She leaned a bit closer to the table. "You've been married 3 times. Don't you think it's a bit hypocritical for someone who couldn't make 2 marriages work to write books about relationships?" The audience was quiet, waiting for Steve's reaction. He just nodded. "You're right, Joy," he said calmly. "I have been married 3 times. He paused, then continued. "You know why? Because I kept trying until I got it right." Some people in the crowd murmured in approval. "That's what winners do," Steve said. "They don't quit after one failure. They learn from it, get up, and try again." He leaned back. "My 3rd marriage has been strong for 20 years now." Then he looked at Joy. "How long have your marriages lasted?" The question hung in the air. Joy's face turned a bit red. "We're not talking about me," she said quickly. "We're talking about you." "Oh, I see," Steve said, leaning forward. "So it's okay to dig into my life. Yours is off limits?" The audience laughed again. "That's a standard for journalism, Joy," he said. "Do they teach that in the handbook? Did you come up with that one yourself?" The laughter grew louder. It was clear that the conversation was not going as Joy had planned. Sunny Huston covered her mouth, trying to hide a smile. Even Whoopi Goldberg looked amused. Joy tried to control the conversation. "Look," she said, adjusting her tone. "All I'm saying is that you've built a career giving advice about things you're not an expert in." She continued, pressing her point. "Relationship advice from someone who failed at marriage twice. Life advice from someone who admits he barely finished school." Then she delivered the jab. "Don't you think people deserve credentials from the people they treat like gurus?" The room was tense again. Steve did not look fazed. If anything, his eyes got sharper. "Finished high school?" He repeated quietly. Then he nodded slowly. "Joy, I grew up in Cleveland in a working-class family. I didn't have the luxury of attending schools." He paused, his tone getting more serious. "But you know what I did have?" The audience leaned in. "I had hunger," he said. "I had determination. I had the willingness to fail again and again until I finally succeeded." His voice softened. The weight behind his words grew stronger. "You want to talk about credentials?" He leaned forward. "My credentials are sleeping in my car for 3 years while I tried to make it as a comedian." The audience was silent. "My credentials are performing in clubs where people threw things at me because I wasn't funny yet." He paused again. "My credentials are being so broke that I had to decide between buying food or putting gas in my car." Then he looked at Joy. "That's my degree, Joy. The School of Knox." He gestured lightly. "Cool. That degree is worth more than any piece of paper hanging on a wall." The studio erupted in applause. Steve had taken what was meant to be an insult and turned it into something of shrinking from his past. He had turned it into proof of his authenticity. Joy's face was red. She wasn't finished. "That's a story, Steve," she said, her voice tight. "Very inspiring." Then she shifted the topic. "Let's talk about something more recent." She leaned back. "The Miss Universe incident." Some people in the audience reacted. "You announced the winner on live television in front of millions of people," Joy said. "You embarrassed that woman in front of the entire world." She paused before delivering the line. "And somehow, that huge mistake made you more famous." Her eyebrows lifted. "Don't you think there's something with a culture that rewards incompetence?" The mention of that moment made some people in the audience shift. For public figures, that kind of mistake could have ended a career. Steve Harvey just smiled. A wide, genuine smile filled the studio. "Joy, I'm glad you brought that up," he said calmly. "That was the moment of my professional life." The room was quiet. "I made a mistake in front of hundreds of millions of people," Steve said. "And you know what I did next?" He answered his question. "I apologized. I took responsibility. I didn't make excuses. I didn't blame anyone else." He leaned forward. "I stood on that stage. I owned my mistake completely." Then he looked at Joy. "Now let me ask you something." Steve said, "Let me ask you something." He looked at Joy, his eyes steady. "When was the last time you said sorry for something you did on this show?" The question was like a punch. He asked again, "When was the last time you admitted you were wrong? When was the last time you said something that hurt someone? You actually said sorry for it?" The studio was silent. Steve kept talking, his voice calm. "I watch this show sometimes. I hear a lot of strong opinions. I do not see a lot of people taking responsibility when they are wrong." His words hit hard. Joy wanted to say something. She could not think of anything. The audience felt the tension. They knew this conversation was getting serious. Steve said, "The difference between you and me, Joy, is that I know I am not perfect." He leaned forward a little. "I know I make mistakes. I am not afraid to say sorry." He stopped for a moment. "You sit at this table every day acting like your opinions are facts, like you are the one who matters, like anyone who disagrees with you is not smart, does not deserve respect." Steve shook his head slowly. "That is not journalism. That is not a good conversation." His voice was calm. His words were strong. "That is your ego acting like it is expertise." The audience started to murmur. Steve said, "And the sad part is, you have been doing it for long. You probably do not even realize it anymore." His words hit hard. Joy did not look as confident as she did before. She said, "I think you are being too sensitive to things people are saying." Her voice was not as strong as it was before. Steve laughed. It was a laugh. He said, "Oversensitive? Joy, I just told you I slept in my car for 3 years." The audience leaned in to hear more. He said, "I have been heckled by people in comedy clubs. I have been rejected by networks before someone finally gave me a chance." He spread his hands. "I have been called every name you can imagine by people who did not think a black man from Cleveland should be successful." Then he smiled. You think a couple of tough questions from you are going to hurt my feelings?" The audience laughed. Steve said, "Baby, I have been through much to be bothered by someone who thinks their opinion is the most important thing in the room." The audience started to clap. Steve said, "I have faced problems, real struggle, real failure. I am still here, still smiling, still doing well." He leaned back in his chair. "So with all respect, you are going to have to try a lot harder than that if you want to shake me." The audience clapped loudly. Steve handled everything with confidence, humor, and calmness. Joy looked uncomfortable. Sarah Haynes tried to change the subject. "Maybe we should talk about Family Feud and how successful you have been with the show," she said. Joy was not ready to let it go. She said, "Actually, I have one question." The room was quiet again. Steve said, "Okay, ask your question." Joy said, "Steve, you have talked about your faith and God's plan for your life. You have also said things that people thought were offensive." She said, "You once said atheists do not have a barometer. You have made comments about other religions that people felt were intolerant." Then she leaned forward a little. "How do you make sense of being a man of faith and saying things that many people consider intolerant?" Steve did not hesitate. "Joy, I am a Christian. I believe what I believe." He nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, there have been times when I have said things that needed to be explained or apologized for." His tone was steady. "Because I am human. I am still learning and growing just like everyone else." Then he tilted his head a little. "I find it interesting that you are questioning my tolerance while sitting at a table where you have made critical comments about people of faith for years." Joy's face got tighter. Steve said, "You have mocked Christians. You have dismissed people as backwards or ignorant." He spoke calmly. "You have laughed at beliefs that millions of Americans consider sacred." Then he looked directly at her. "Before you question my tolerance, maybe take a moment to look at the glass house you are sitting in." The audience reacted with gasps and applause. Steve said, "Because from where I'm standing, that glass looks pretty fragile." Joy's face turned red. "That is not the thing at all," she said quickly. "I question beliefs. I do not attack people." Steve's voice was soft. His words were precise. Do you not? The studio was quiet again. Steve said, because it sure feels like an attack when you question someone's credentials, their marriages, their education, their faith, all within 10 minutes. He paused briefly. It feels like an attack when you bring up the moment of someone's career just to embarrass them in front of an audience. The tension in the room was almost too much. Everyone watching could sense that the conversation had reached a breaking point. It feels like an attack when you say someone does not deserve their success just because they did not take the path you think they should have taken. Steve stopped talking for a moment, letting what he said sink in. He said, I came on this show to talk about something I'm proud of, to maybe share some laughs and to give people something to think about. He looked at the person across from him. But you had an idea, Steve said. The room got really quiet. Steve said, you wanted to make me look bad. You wanted to show that you were smarter than Steve, better than Steve, and more sophisticated than Steve. He shook his head a bit. Steve said, the funny thing is, while you were trying to prove all that, you actually proved the opposite. The room was completely silent. Joy looked really surprised, like Steve's words had hit her harder than she thought they would. She said, what do you mean by that? Her voice was shaking now. Steve was still. That made what he said even more powerful. He said, it means that people who are really confident do not need to make others look bad to feel good about themselves. Steve is saying that truly confident people do not need to tear others down. Steve said, it means that people who are really smart can disagree without being mean. Intelligent people can disagree without becoming disrespectful. He leaned back in his chair, looking really relaxed. Steve said, and it means that people who are really sophisticated know how to treat their guests with respect. Even when they do not agree with them, sophisticated people know how to treat a guest with basic respect. The people watching were paying attention. Steve said, you have been trying to make Steve look bad this time, but all you have really done is show everyone what kind of person you are when you think you are in charge. Steve is saying that you have been trying to make him look bad. He stopped talking for a moment. Steve said, and I have to be honest with you, Joy. Steve has got to be honest with you. His voice was still calm. Steve said, it does not look good on you. It is not a look. Steve is saying that it is not a good look. For a second, the room was silent. Then people started clapping, and it got louder and louder. People were standing up, cheering. Joy looked around the room, and she seemed shocked, frustrated, and did not believe what was happening. Steve's words had clearly affected her. She said, this is ridiculous. I asked questions, and you turned this into a personal attack against me. Joy is saying that Steve turned this into a personal attack. Steve shook his head, still smiling. He said, no, Joy, you made it personal when you questioned Steve's marriages, Steve's education, Steve's faith, and Steve's right to give advice. Steve is saying that you made it personal. Steve said, I just responded. The only difference is that Steve responded with facts and humor, not sarcasm and talking down to people. Steve responded with facts and humor. The people watching clapped again. Steve said, that is the difference between someone who had to work to win people over and someone who always thought their opinion was the only one that mattered. Steve is saying that is the difference. Joy stood up. Her chair made a loud noise on the floor. She said, I do not have to sit and be insulted by a game show host. Joy is saying that she does not have to sit here and be insulted. Steve did not raise his voice. He just said, actually, Joy, that's exactly what you do for a living. Steve is saying that you do that for a living. The people watching were. Then they started laughing. Steve said, you sit here and insult people every day. The only difference is that today someone answered back. Steve is saying that you sit here and insult people every day. Steve said, you can say mean things to people, but you cannot take it when someone says something back to you. Steve is saying that you can dish it out, but you cannot take it. The room erupted in cheers and applause. It was a moment that people would talk about for a time. Joy stood there looking angry and embarrassed. Then she walked off the set, the people watching. Then they cheered even louder. The other hosts just sat there looking shocked and unsure of what to do. For a second, nobody said anything. Then Whoopi Goldberg spoke up. She said, well, I think we are going to take a break. Whoopi is saying that they are going to take a commercial break. Steve raised his hand and said, before we do that, Whoopi, may Steve say one more thing. Steve is asking if he can say one more thing. Steve turned to the audience. The cameras were focused on him. The room got quiet again. Steve said, Steve did not come here to fight with anyone. Steve did not come here to embarrass Joy, and Steve did not come here to prove anything about himself. Steve is saying that he did not come here to fight. He stopped talking for a moment. His voice was a little softer. Steve said, but when someone is mean to you, you really only have two choices. Steve is saying that you really only have two choices. Steve said to the people, you have two choices. You can let someone walk over you, or you can stand up for yourself with dignity." He stopped talking for a moment. Then he said, "I chose dignity." His voice was not as loud when he looked at the people watching him. Steve said, "I have been very lucky in my life. I went from having nothing to living a life I once only dreamed about." The people watching him were listening carefully. Steve also said, "I learned something: you teach people how to treat you." He thought about this for a moment. If you let people disrespect you, they will keep doing it. When you show people that you respect yourself, most of them will respect you too. Then Steve smiled. The ones who don't. He did not finish what he was saying. The people watching him. Steve smiled again. This was a smile that many people recognized. He turned to the table, said to Sarah, "I think you wanted to ask me something about Family Feud." The show kept going. The tension went away as Steve started talking about other things. He talked about how Family Feud was doing, and he told stories about his family. He also talked about the things he was going to do. In a minute, the feeling in the studio was different again. Steve was being funny and charming. He was the person that people had liked for a long time. Everyone in the studio knew they had just seen something. For the time, a guest had changed the way the show was going, but not by being angry or mean. Steve did it by being funny, confident, and calm. When the show was over and the people were leaving the studio, one thing was clear. Steve Harvey had gone into the studio as a guest. He left as a legend. He did not do it by being harsh or mean. He did it by showing people how to handle criticism and disrespect with calmness and self-respect. This moment did not end when the cameras stopped recording. People were talking about it on media, and they were sharing clips from the interview. Steve's responses were shared times. People were also talking about Joy walking off the show. They were making jokes about it. Many people were analyzing what had happened. They were talking about interviews with famous people and how power works. The most important thing that happened was that it started a bigger conversation. Steve showed that you can defend yourself without losing your dignity. You can win an argument without hurting the person. You can be strong without being angry. In a world where people often like to see outrage and negativity, Steve reminded everyone that being kind, funny, and respectful can be the way to respond. So what do you think about what happened with Steve Harvey? Did he handle the situation perfectly? Do you think he went too far? You can share what you think in the comments. Do not forget to subscribe to see more interesting stories.